The German cryptographers gathered in Berlin reviewed their calculations one more time. The numbers were absolute. Their Enigma machine, with its rotors and plugboard settings, created 158 quintillion, 962 trillion, 555 billion, 217 million, 826,360 possible combinations. To test every single one, even if you could check 1,000 settings per second, would take 5 billion years. The machine was mathematically unbreakable. It had to be. They had no idea that in a manor house in rural England, mathematicians and linguists were reading their most secret communications almost as fast as German commanders received them. But eventually, evidence would accumulate. Questions would be asked, investigations would be launched, and the answers German high command reached would be catastrophically, fatally wrong. This is the story of what happened when the Third Reich began to suspect their codes might be compromised, what they said, what they did about it, and why they convinced themselves that the impossible wasn't happening. Spring of 1942. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of Germany's U-boat fleet, stood over a map of the Atlantic scattered with pins marking convoy routes. Something was wrong. British convoys were routing around his submarine patrol lines with uncanny precision. Ships that should have sailed straight into his wolfpacks were instead making inexplicable course changes, sometimes just hours before contact, steering clear of his submarines positioned hundreds of miles from land. The losses were mounting. U-boats returning to port reported the same story. They'd take up positions based on intelligence about convoy routes, then wait as the targets simply never appeared. The convoys were somewhere else, taking routes that made no tactical sense unless they somehow knew exactly where German submarines were waiting. Dönitz was not a man prone to paranoia, but he was a man who paid attention to patterns. He ordered an investigation. If the British were reading his communications, it would mean the loss of Germany's most effective weapon against Allied shipping. The U-boat war was Germany's best chance of strangling Britain's supply lines. If that advantage was compromised, the war might be lost. The investigation landed on the desk of the German Navy's cryptographic service. They approached the question methodically. Could Enigma be broken? The answer they returned was unequivocal. No. Mathematically impossible. They walked Dönitz through the logic. The Enigma machine used by the Navy wasn't even the standard military version. It was more complex, with additional rotors and more sophisticated encipherment. Where the Wehrmacht used 3 rotors, selected from a set of 5, the Navy used 4 rotors, selected from a set of 8. The plugboard alone created billions of possible configurations. The daily key settings changed everything. Even if the British had captured an Enigma machine intact, which seemed unlikely, they would need to know the specific rotor settings, plugboard connections, and ring positions for that day, and those changed every 24 hours. The cryptographers presented calculations. To break Enigma by brute force, testing every possible combination, would require resources that simply didn't exist. You would need thousands of people working around the clock, with perfect organization, testing millions of settings per day. And even then, by the time you found the right settings, they would have changed. It was impossible. The British couldn't be reading their codes. So, what explained the convoy routing? The cryptographers offered alternatives. Traffic analysis, perhaps. The British might be tracking the volume and origin of radio signals without reading the content. If they detected increased U-boat radio activity in a certain area, they could route convoys elsewhere. Or direction finding. The British had improved their high-frequency direction finding systems. They could triangulate U-boat positions from radio transmissions, or radar. Intelligence suggested the British had made significant advances in radar technology, or espionage. Perhaps there were traitors, German agents who had been turned, feeding information to the British. Any of these explanations made more sense than the mathematical impossibility of breaking Enigma. Dönitz accepted the assessment. He had to. The alternative was too devastating to contemplate. He ordered improved radio discipline. U-boats were instructed to transmit less frequently, to keep messages shorter, to maintain radio silence when possible. If the British were using direction finding or traffic analysis, this would help. The convoy routing patterns continued. What Dönitz didn't know was that at Bletchley Park, in a section called Hut 8, a team led by mathematicians including Alan Turing had done what German cryptographers calculated was impossible. They hadn't broken Enigma by testing every combination. They'd found weaknesses in how the Germans used the machine. Repeated phrases, predictable message formats, operators who made mistakes. The Germans began many messages with the same routine phrases. Weather reports followed standard formats. These regularities created patterns, and patterns could be exploited. The British had also built machines of their own, devices called bombs that could test thousands of possible rotor settings in hours, not years. The bombs didn't try every possible combination. They used logical deduction, eliminating impossible settings based on known patterns, narrowing the search space from quintillions to thousands. But in Berlin, German High Command had no concept that such methods were possible. Their mathematical analysis was correct about brute force being impossible. They simply couldn't imagine the elegant shortcuts that made it possible anyway. The investigation concluded. Enigma was secure. The increased Allied success must have other explanations. Then came May of 1943. In the span of 1 month, Dönitz lost 43 U-boats in the North Atlantic. 43 in a single month. The losses were catastrophic, unsustainable. Young men who'd left port in submarines simply never came back. The wolfpack tactics that had been so effective were now sending crews to their deaths. Allied aircraft appeared over submarines that were supposedly operating in secret positions. Destroyers converged on U-boats as if they knew exactly where to look. Convoys avoided patrol lines with impossible consistency. Dönitz was forced to withdraw his U-boats from the North Atlantic entirely. The Battle of the Atlantic, which Germany had been winning, suddenly turned. The submarine force that had brought Britain to the edge of starvation was now hiding in port because the ocean had become too dangerous. This demanded answers. Dönitz ordered another investigation, more thorough this time. The Kriegsmarine's B-Dienst, Germany's own naval intelligence and code-breaking service, was brought in. These were men who understood signals intelligence. B-Dienst had successfully broken British naval codes earlier in the war. They knew it was possible to read enemy communications. If anyone could determine whether Enigma was compromised, it was them. B-Dienst approached the question from every angle. They examined captured Allied documents for any hint that German codes had been broken. They interrogated prisoners, listening for any slip that might reveal Allied knowledge of German communications. They analyzed the pattern of Allied responses to German operations, looking for evidence of foreknowledge. They found nothing conclusive. Yes, the Allies seemed to know too much. But there were always alternative explanations. The British had captured U-boats. They'd recovered documents, code books, even Enigma machines from sunken submarines. Perhaps they'd captured enough material to read some messages. But that would only give them limited access, only to messages sent with settings they'd captured. It couldn't explain the comprehensive intelligence the British seemed to possess. B-Dienst's conclusion echoed the earlier investigation. Enigma itself remained secure. The machine's design was sound. The mathematical principles were unbreakable. If the British were gaining intelligence, it must be through captured materials, through espionage, through technical means like radar and direction finding. The investigators did recommend improvements. The Navy added another rotor to some Enigma machines. They changed key-setting procedures. They increased security around code books and daily settings. They improved training for radio operators, emphasizing the importance of following procedures exactly. But they did not conclude that Enigma was broken, because that remained mathematically impossible. What the Germans couldn't see was that their own success was blinding them. Bedienst's earlier achievements in breaking British naval codes had given German commanders a false confidence. They'd broken Allied codes, so they understood how code-breaking worked. You needed captured materials, cribs, knowledge of the system. You needed the enemy to make mistakes. The British were making fewer mistakes now, so Bedienst was having less success reading their traffic. This seemed to confirm that good security practices made codes unbreakable. The Germans couldn't conceive that the British had made a fundamental breakthrough they themselves had not. That the British had industrialized code breaking, creating an entire facility with thousands of people and specialized machines dedicated to the task. That the British were exploiting weaknesses in operational procedures that German cryptographers had never considered vulnerabilities. There was also institutional pride at stake. The men who designed Enigma, who maintained its security, who trained operators in its use, had built their careers on this machine. To admit it was broken would be to admit their life's work had failed. The psychological pressure to find alternative explanations was immense, and there were alternative explanations that seemed plausible. German intelligence knew the British had made advances in radar technology. They'd captured examples of cavity magnetrons that enabled centimetric radar. They knew about high-frequency direction finding. They had evidence of Allied spy networks. Any of these could explain British intelligence successes without requiring the impossible breakthrough of breaking Enigma. So the war continued. German commanders sent orders by Enigma, believing their communications were secure. The British read those orders at Bletchley Park and passed the intelligence to commanders in the field. Allied ships avoided U-boat patrol lines. Allied aircraft found German submarines. Allied armies knew German plans before attacks began, and in Berlin, German High Command continued to trust the mathematics that said this couldn't be happening. There were dissenting voices. Some officers questioned whether Enigma could truly be secure. Some pointed to the statistical improbability of British success being purely due to radar and direction finding. But these voices were dismissed. The cryptographers had done the calculations. The machine was unbreakable. To believe otherwise was to believe in magic. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr Military Intelligence Service, had his own suspicions. The Abwehr used Enigma for its communications, and Canaris had seen too many operations fail. Too many agents captured immediately upon arrival in Britain, too many supposedly secret plans discovered by the enemy. But even Canaris, when he raised concerns, was met with the same mathematical certainty. Enigma was secure. The failures must have other causes. The Germans did catch some Allied intelligence operations. They captured spies, rolled up networks, found evidence of espionage. Each time this seemed to confirm that espionage was the explanation for Allied intelligence success. They were finding the answer, they thought. It was human intelligence, not signals intelligence. They were solving the problem. They had no way to know that while they were catching some spies, the vast majority of Allied intelligence was coming from a source they refused to believe existed. The irony was that German security practices were actually quite good in many ways. They changed settings daily. They had elaborate procedures for distributing keys. They trained operators extensively. They modified the machines over time, adding complexity. These measures would have defeated most code-breaking efforts. They just weren't enough against the industrial-scale, mathematically sophisticated operation at Bletchley Park. By 1944, some German commanders were operating with an assumption that their communications might not be entirely secure. Not because they believed Enigma was broken, but because they'd learned through hard experience that somehow the Allies knew too much. These commanders began using couriers for the most sensitive information, limiting radio traffic, using code words and vague language even in enciphered messages. But this was operational caution, not a conclusion that Enigma itself was compromised. It was the same logic as not discussing sensitive information on a telephone, even though you don't believe anyone is listening. Just good security practice. The war ended. Germany surrendered. The Enigma machines were captured, studied, collected as souvenirs. German cryptographers were interrogated by Allied intelligence. And still, the truth was not revealed. The Allies kept Ultra, the code-breaking operation, completely secret. They wanted to continue using the techniques and machines they'd developed. They wanted potential future enemies to have no idea what was possible. German commanders went home, or to prisoner of war camps, or to war crimes trials, believing that Enigma had remained secure. In their memoirs, in their post-war writings, they analyzed why Germany lost. They discussed strategic mistakes, industrial capacity, the two-front war, Hitler's interference in military decisions. They did not discuss compromised communications because they didn't know communications had been compromised. Dönitz, in his memoirs published in the 1950s, analyzed the Battle of the Atlantic. He discussed the Allies' technological advantages. He acknowledged that Allied radar and direction finding had been better than German intelligence had estimated. He mentioned captured materials and possible espionage. He did not mention that the British had been reading virtually every U-boat communication from 1941 onward. The secret held for nearly 3 decades. Then, in 1974, a former RAF officer named Frederick Winterbotham published a book titled The Ultra Secret. For the first time, the public learned about Bletchley Park, about the code-breaking operation, about the fact that the Allies had read German Enigma traffic throughout the war. The revelation stunned the historical community. It required rewriting the history of World War II. Suddenly, Allied decisions that had seemed lucky or brilliant were revealed to be based on comprehensive intelligence, and in Germany, surviving commanders learned the truth. Karl Dönitz was 83 years old when Winterbotham's book was published. He'd spent nearly 30 years believing that his U-boat tactics had been defeated by Allied technology and resources. Now he learned that the British had been reading his orders to his submarine commanders. Every position report, every attack plan, every tactical instruction had been intercepted and decrypted, often within hours of transmission. His reaction, recorded in interviews, was one of profound shock and devastation. The men who died under his command, the thousands of young submariners who'd gone to the bottom of the Atlantic, had been sent into battle with the enemy reading their orders. The tactical decisions he'd agonized over, the careful positioning of wolfpacks, the coordination of attacks, all of it had been visible to the enemy in real time. Other surviving German commanders reacted with similar disbelief. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who'd commanded German forces in Italy, learned that his defensive plans had been read by the Allies before he'd even issued them to his subordinate units. General Heinz Guderian, the panzer commander, discovered that his tank movements had been tracked through decrypted communications. The reaction wasn't just shock at the intelligence failure. It was a fundamental reassessment of the war. Battles that had seemed like narrow defeats were revealed to have been unwinnable. The Allies had known too much. Tactical surprises that failed were now understood to have never been surprises at all. The entire strategic picture shifted. Some German officers reacted with anger. They felt betrayed by their own cryptographers, by the assurances that Enigma was secure. Others reacted with a kind of resignation. The war had been lost for many reasons. This was simply one more, albeit a significant one. But underlying all the reactions was a common theme. They genuinely hadn't known. This wasn't a case of suspicions confirmed. It was a complete revelation. The mathematical certainty that Enigma was unbreakable had been so absolute that even decades later, learning it had been broken felt impossible. The question that haunted some of them was whether they should have known, whether the evidence had been there all along and they'd simply refused to see it, whether the institutional certainty had blinded them to reality. Looking back at the wartime investigations, the answer is complex. The German cryptographers weren't incompetent. Their mathematical analysis was correct given their assumptions. Brute force breaking of Enigma was impossible. What they failed to imagine was that the British would find shortcuts, would exploit operational weaknesses rather than attacking the machine's mathematical strength directly. The Germans also suffered from a failure of imagination about scale. They couldn't conceive of an operation the size of Bletchley Park, with thousands of people dedicated solely to code breaking, with purpose-built machines, with that level of resources devoted to signals intelligence. In the German military structure, code breaking was a specialized function within intelligence services. It wasn't an industrial operation. They couldn't imagine their enemies organizing it differently. There was also the problem of confirmation bias. Every time the Germans investigated and found alternative explanations for Allied intelligence success, it reinforced their belief that Enigma was secure. They were finding answers, just not the right answer. And because they kept finding plausible alternatives, they never seriously entertained the implausible truth. The post-war revelation also explained smaller mysteries that had puzzled German commanders. Times when the Allies had seemed to know things they couldn't possibly know through conventional intelligence. Operations that failed for no apparent reason. Coincidences that had seemed too coincidental. All of it made sense once you knew the Allies were reading German communications in near real time. For historians, the revelation transformed understanding of the war. Battles were reanalyzed with the knowledge that one side had been reading the other's mail. Strategic decisions were re-examined. The importance of intelligence in modern warfare was understood in new ways. The development of computer science and cryptography was traced back to Bletchley Park's innovations. But for the German commanders who lived long enough to learn the truth, it was personal. These weren't just historical facts. These were the orders they'd given, the men they'd commanded, the decisions they'd made. Learning that the enemy had known their plans all along meant confronting the possibility that those decisions had sent men to their deaths unnecessarily. Some tried to calculate how the war might have been different if Enigma had truly been secure. Would Germany have won the Battle of the Atlantic? Would the North African campaign have gone differently? Would D-Day have succeeded if the Germans had known where and when it was coming? The consensus among military historians is that Ultra shortened the war significantly, perhaps by 2 years, and saved countless lives on the Allied side. But whether it changed the ultimate outcome is debated. Germany faced overwhelming industrial and manpower disadvantages. Breaking Enigma gave the Allies a crucial advantage, but it wasn't the only factor in Germany's defeat. What's certain is that the German High Command's certainty that their codes were secure was one of the great intelligence failures of the war. Not because they were stupid or incompetent, but because they asked the wrong questions. They asked whether Enigma could be broken by brute force and got the correct answer. No. They never asked whether it could be broken by other means. They never imagined the scale of effort the British would devote to the problem. They never considered that operational procedures might be the weakness rather than the machine itself. The story of what German High Command said when they learned their codes were compromised is ultimately a story about the limits of certainty. The cryptographers who assured Dönitz that Enigma was unbreakable weren't lying. They believed it absolutely, based on sound mathematical reasoning. The commanders who accepted those assurances weren't naive. They were trusting experts in a technical field beyond their own expertise. But certainty, even mathematical certainty, can be wrong if it's based on incomplete assumptions. The Germans were certain that breaking Enigma by testing every combination was impossible. They were right. They just never imagined someone would find a way to break it without testing every combination. When the truth finally emerged in 1974, 30 years after the war ended, the surviving German commanders had to confront a reality they'd been certain was impossible. Their reactions, shock and disbelief and anger and resignation, were the reactions of men learning that something they'd staked their lives and the lives of their men on had been catastrophically wrong. They'd asked their cryptographers if the codes could be broken. The answer had been no. They'd investigated when evidence suggested otherwise. The answer had remained no. They'd trusted the mathematics, trusted the experts, trusted the machine. And the British had been reading their mail the entire time.